So, which one is the appropriate mechanism? Which one balances, strikes the balance between irrigation consumptive uses versus the environmental uses? Depends a lot on the characteristics of that demand. So, and these demands can either complement or conflict depending on the kind of periods you're considering. So, I'll talk about a bit more that irrigation demands ultimately depend on the industry. So, perennial horticulture has really inelastic water demands for a fixed volume. They've got to keep their sort of biological assets of trees and vines alive no matter what. And they were the driving factor that led to really high water prices in drought conditions. Dairy can react a bit more, being semi-interruptible. They can substitute, as we've heard in other presentations at this conference, substitute away to fodder, and I think I've learned a lot of how to manage a dairy farm in drought without using much irrigation water at all. And then at the other end of the spectrum, annual crops. They were talking like the rice and cottons out in the MDB, that once you've got the water you can plant, produce a crop, it's in a fixed amount of period, but you aren't required to source that water in a dry period. You've got all the factors in your hands of whether or not you want to make a buck or sell off your water. The environmental demands are also very different in characteristics in terms of the minimum flows for maintaining refugia or connectivity, where as opposed to regular-ish small floods that Anna talked about and the occasional large floods. And so in the dry years, there's conflict. When you get hot and minimum flows for the environment fighting out over the water, it's whoever's got the deepest pocket might win. Whereas in wetter periods, we might see some real benefits from trade, where we can say that we can source water for floods from a very low opportunity cost from the water market. So there's a lot of science in the Basin Plan that sort of tells us something about what these environmental demands look like. So this is effectively the same information that Anna showed you, that they've got a small flood measure and how often we have to get it in order to achieve some degree of certainty of our environmental outcome. So our frequent small floods in kind of Burgundy is of the 25 to 30 megalitres a day, and for 7 to 14 days. And we want those 60 or 40% of the time, where the other circle is, as opposed to occasional large floods, and this is for the Goulburn floodplain, where we want a lot larger volumes of the 45 to 60 megalitres a day, but we only want them in 25 or 30% of the time. I haven't been able to find this kind of clear exposition of how much water the environment needs in the dry years to maintain the refugia. And I think that's critical to get the balance right. So, out of all of those range of different curvy, pretty charts that I put up, which one is embedded within the Basin Plan? Well, there's some draft accreditation tests that the states will have to meet in order to get their water resource plans accredited by the MDBA. And the one I want to focus on, so there's 170 draft tests, so I want to talk about 6. And effectively, they equate the term equitable sharing within the document to say equal sharing. That means in a year of dry water availability, or in a 10-year period, so over the last 10 years, the Goulburn system has had 40% less water in terms of average water availability than it did from the long-run historical record. But irrigators only face a 25% reduction in the amount of water that they were allocated. The principle of equitable sharing says irrigators have to cop 40% because that's what the resource is shrunk by, and then the environmental share will shrink by 45% as well. And so equitable sharing means equal sharing. In terms of, if you're a mathsy person, this is the equation that sort of represents these 5 terms. It says, I can talk about it to you later if you want the details. Effectively, the permitted take is going to be a factor of the sustainable diversion limit times by this average water availability within a given period. So as opposed to the main document that says we're looking at long-run averages, in fact, state water resource plans have to say, well, over the historical period we have to meet our SDL, but over a 10-year dry period we have to meet this modified SDL test. Over a 10-year wet period we have to meet it. What's more is that we have to meet it for a historical as well as a climate change scenario. So you can imagine that the 10-year dry period under a median climate change scenario is actually a lot more of a binding test to water management than this long-run average. So, in other words, the nice, smooth, curvy, proportional reductions that we're looking at that buyback can achieve only would be meeting the permitted take test. Water resource plans would have to go further. They need to start to take away a lot more water in dry periods to, in terms of to meet the equitable sharing tests, in that are balancing water use in dry periods, as well as meeting the fact that we're reallocating large long-run values. Maybe if it comes to questions, I can always I have a simple numerical example for this. So I guess our quick findings are that if we implement some of the proposals of the Basin Plan, we seek to significantly affect supply reliability of existing water resources. Basically, a buyback type strategy to achieve these reduced volumes don't provide all of the water with the right characteristics and the right timing. And of course, we've heard many times this conference that volume's not everything. We've got to go a lot further than that. But even at the volume measure, buyback doesn't measure up. And we need to see some potential impact on reliability. That's the risk, and that's the numerical example. Basically, the 25% change in average diversions. Sorry, I'll just keep moving so we can have a look at the last question here. So what does it all mean for irrigating industries? So, grossly stylised model of the marginal value of production into different crops. So if there's one drop of water out there, I'm guessing horticulture is going to use it to keep their trees and vines alive. As there's more and more water available, the next best marginal use of water becomes dairy and then ultimately annual crops. So if we were to look at this and say, how do we evaluate the cost of a long-run average change to water availability? And this is what ABARE, this is again a gross stylisation of what ABARE did when they were first assessing how much is the Basin Plan going to cost us in terms of economic impact. By changing the long-run average, effectively they found that water was going to be taken out of annual cropping and some dairy, and horticultural impacts in these higher value industries weren't necessarily affected. Obviously it's very stylised, but it makes pretty pictures. If we were to overlay that instead with what does it mean under variability, we start to tell the story that we often see about production within the Murray-Darling Basin. During wet years and dry years, we see different industries popping up. Horticulture is a bit of a pervasive thing, and if you were there for Glenn Whitworth's talk on the first day of the conference, you would have heard that between wet and dry periods, horticulture's value of production didn't actually change, whereas annual crops such as rice contracted by 90%. And so that's what we're seeing up here, having those annual crops popping up when there's lots of water available and then basically shutting down during the dry periods like we see in the Australian rice industry. And dairy crops at a bit. Whereas instead of taking things away on average and losing it from the annual crops, where is this water going to come from if we're taking it away in a dry year? So I guess what I wanted to put up in flashing lights is that if we're going to have to meet these more rigorous tests on how we're sourcing our water for the environment, it could in fact be that we lose a little bit of annual crops around the edges. Dairy and horticulture start to be facing a lot more of the impacts. And obviously this is a much more significant economic impact than if we were just taking off the low-hanging fruit. Now, if you had trees and vines and you hit one of these low periods where there's not enough water, you'd see a structural shift because the horticultural industry would have to contract in order to meet it. So I think, as we've heard at this conference, the Basin Plan would lead to a change in the industry mix. But I think it could be a change in the other direction. Rather than a change to see the end of annual cropping and losing the rice and cotton out of the system, I think if we're changing the volatility of supply, we could actually have to re-evaluate which of the high security industries can be maintained. So looking forward, I think the Basin Plan or the MDBA needs to grapple with the fact that equitable doesn't mean equal. And the quote up there is an excerpt from the Water Encyclopedia that really tries to focus on equity of access rather than equity of volume, because volume is a very crude measure of benefit when it comes to irrigation in terms of volatility, and is also when it comes to the water for the environment. So I think modelling the economic impacts of the Basin Plan, the first step assessments that have been made to date are a focus on those long-term averages so we can get in order to get our head around things. But given the detail that sort of nestled within Appendix E of Volume 2 of the 13,000 documents that they released, I think there's more research that's required to consider the impacts under variability. And this is to assess the proposals. And in only understanding this detail can we make efficiency improvements to make it do it better. And really, I think the working title for this little mini-symposium was striking a better balance between water users. We need to start to embrace the dynamic sense of water management that we're seeing between an environmental water user who's willing to buy and sell allocations and entitlements, and not just applying flexible allocation rules, and especially not focusing on equitable sharing as they've interpreted and long-term averages. Thank you.